Chapter 5 Storm and Stress. I wanna thank you, Mom. I wanna thank you, Dad, for bringing this fucking world to a bitter end. Marilyn Manson. Disposable Teens. Overview. American teens are among the most distressed in the world, and they are also the most distressed segment of American society. G. Stanley Hall, the pioneering psychologist who first defined adolescence 100 years ago, insisted that the storm and stress we see during the teen years was an inevitable outcome of evolutionary processes. His theory, however, was based on a faulty theory from biology that was completely discredited by the 1930s. Turmoil is not a necessary feature of the teen years. On the other hand, in several areas, crime, conflict with parents, high-risk behaviors, substance abuse and mood disorders, American teens are often in bad shape, and new research shows a relationship between the degree of impairment and the degree to which teens are infantilized. Let's start by talking about blatant fraud, a persistent myth and a faulty theory. The fraud, mislabeling and then lying about images of animal embryos printed in a scientific text. The persistent myth that as we grow, we relive the evolutionary history of our species. The faulty theory, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. The idea that individual development, ontogeny, mimics evolutionary development. Phylogeny got its start in the 1800s with biologists such as the Frenchman Alcide Dessalines d'Orbigny and the German Johann Friedrich Meckel, known in history books as the Younger because his distinguished grandfather had the same name. But the theory became elevated to law status, the so-called fundamental law of biogenetics, in the late 1800s by the German naturalist Ernst Haeckel. In his popular book, The Natural History of Creation, Natürliche Schaffungsgeschichte, published in 1868, Haeckel appeared to demonstrate that developing embryos of various species all resembled each other in their early stages and all passed through stages that seemed to mimic evolutionary history. At first, he said, young embryos look like fish with gills, then like reptiles with tails, and so on. He showed drawings printed from woodcuts of embryos from humans, monkeys, dogs and other species which appeared to prove his point. 1 He was passionate about his theory, mainly because it seemed to him to lend support to Darwin's new theory of evolution, published in 1859. Darwin himself was impressed by Haeckel's ideas, and he was also grateful to Haeckel for promoting evolutionary theory among German scientists. Point 2 Recapitulation theory caught on among scientists and even in the general public, like Freud's theory of the unconscious. Darwin's theory was, and still is, difficult for most people to understand, but the recapitulation idea is easy. In some places Haeckel's theory was probably more popular than the theory of evolution itself. What's more, even though Haeckel's original claims about recapitulation were restricted to embryos, the idea soon grew. Many people came to believe that we relive the evolutionary history of the human species over the course of our lifetime. But Haeckel's own contemporaries knew his ideas were flawed, and some even spotted a serious defect in his book. Some of his embryo diagrams were identical. Haeckel ultimately admitted that he had made just one diagram and then had the printer repeat it several times, labeling it with different species names in different places. He insisted that the original embryos were so similar that he had committed no great wrong in faking the diagrams. Willful deception, however, doesn't go over well in science, and, among experts, anyway, Haeckel's ideas were soon rejected. Point 3 A highly flawed theory. Haeckel's indiscretions aside, recapitulation theory was weak from the outset. Early embryos of different species actually differ from one another substantially, for one thing. Even if they're alike in superficial respects, that doesn't mean their growth is mimicking evolution. Perhaps embryos just grow from simple, general forms into more specific forms, an idea proposed by Carl Ernst von Baer in 18,284. Haeckel claimed that his embryonic observations provided support for Darwin's theory, but, again, this makes no sense. However embryos happen to grow has no implications for the validity of the theory of evolution. Darwin explained how natural selection, acting over many generations, could account for the diversity of life on Earth. An embryo, like a mature organism, is just a result of that process. It doesn't prove or disprove that evolution occurs. Wisdom of the ages. No need for adolescent revolt. For most of man's existence there was no revolt among youth. Adolescents for thousands of years followed easily in their parents' footsteps. What makes for adolescent revolt is the fact that a society keeps the next generation too long dependent, too long in terms of sexual maturity, and is striving for independence. Bruno Bettelheim, The Children of the Dream, 1969. But here's a funny thing. Haeckel's shoddy ideas caught on not only among many scientists and intellectuals, they also made it into biology texts. What's more, they were repeated from one text to another for generations, probably because textbook writers get a lot of their information from other textbooks. Even more absurd, recapitulation theory is still described in serious terms in a few biology texts today, a fact that the late Stephen Jay Gould said should make us feel astonished and ashamed. He attributed the persistent error to mindless recycling, a phenomenon so widespread in textbook writing, he said, that we may never escape it. Point 5. And what, you may ask, does all this have to do with the artificial extension of childhood? Far too much. G. Stanley Hall, the man who invented adolescence. G. Stanley Hall, the psychologist who put the modern concept of adolescence on the map 100 years ago, believed in recapitulation theory, and his own characterization of adolescence is a spin-off from that theory. To Hall, the turmoil of the teen years was the inevitable consequence of recapitulation. In reliving our evolutionary past, said Hall, we must inevitably pass through a stage of great chaos, some ancient period of storm and stress when old moorings were broken and a higher level attained, a time of savagery, with its tribal, predatory, hunting, fishing, roving, idle, playing proclivities. 6. This is a serious problem. There's an old expression from the computer field, captured by the acronym GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. The computer output you get is only as good as the data you input in the first place. The same is true in science. It's difficult, although not impossible, to derive a good theory from a bad one. If recapitulation theory is bunk, it is then we need to be very skeptical about the validity of Hall's perspective on adolescence. Consider some of Hall's own statements on adolescence. I've added the emphases. While adolescence is the great revealer of the past of the race, its earlier stages must be ever surer and safer, and the later possibilities ever greater and more prolonged. For it, and not maturity as now defined, is the only point of departure for the superanthropoid that man is to become. Point 7. Everything, in short, suggests the culmination of one stage of life as if it thus represented what was once the age of maturity in some remote, perhaps pygmoid, stage of human evolution. Thus the boy is father to the man in a new sense, in that his qualities are indefinitely older and existed well compacted untold ages before the more distinctly human attributes were developed. Point 8. This long pilgrimage of the soul from its old level to a higher maturity which adolescence recapitulates must have taken place in the race in certain of its important lines long before the historic period, because its very nature seems to involve the destruction of all its products and extinction of all records. Just as the well-matured adult has utterly lost all traces and recollection of the perturbations of the storm and stress period, so the race must have gone through a long heat and ferment, of which consciousness, which best develops in stationary periods, was lost, partly because growth was so rapid. Point 9. Hall believed in Haeckel's faulty theory uncritically, and he not only embraced this embryonic theory, he enlarged it, aged it past puberty, and cast it in bronze. Even more disturbing, he did so in a way that makes the underpinnings of his own theory of adolescence virtually invisible to the modern eye. To push this metaphor to the brink, Hall created the life-size, three-dimensional, rock-solid image of teen in turmoil that Americans have believed in for 100 years, but the impressive statue that he sculpted has been resting on a platform composed of the remains of some old German biology texts that long ago decayed to dust. We've already seen that adolescence, as a time of turmoil, is far from inevitable, that it's relatively new in human history, that it's rare in other cultures, and that it can be reversed with serious doses of real responsibility. Hall had access to such information, but he believed in adolescence as a matter of faith, because a tumultuous stage of human development seemed to him to be a requirement of recapitulation theory. At least that's the grand side of Hall's belief. On the more mundane side, Hall was misled by what surrounded him, the hordes of poor and immigrant and working-class youths that dominated the streets of Baltimore, where he was a professor at Johns Hopkins University from 1882 to 1888, the daily headlines covering the debates about youth crime and child labor and compulsory education, the new sentimental attitude toward young people that was blossoming in the late 1800s, the creation and spread of the new juvenile justice system, complete with industrial schools, receiving homes and reformatories, and the powerful new voices of America's nurturing women. Hall's magnum opus, the book that cast adolescence in stone. Hall presented his concept of adolescence in a massive, 1,373-page, two-volume tome called Adolescence, Its Psychology and Its Relations to Physiology, Anthropology, Sociology, Sex, Crime, Religion and Education, published in 1904.10. It was filled with anecdotes and data about troubled teens, but his data could be interpreted in multiple ways, as all data can, and he rarely compared the failings he saw in teens with the failings of his fellow adults. Here is an example of how he described and documented teen problems. Although Hall often provides references, none is given to support these particular anecdotes. Corey and others give many representative cases of grave crime in early puberty in strongly motive temperaments before knowledge and power of control have developed. A young nurse, e.g., having no sense of the value of life, poisoned a child with phosphorus from matches in order that she might go out and seek amusement. A boy of 14 stabbed a playmate who had reproached him. Another of the same age killed a comrade to rob him of 10 sanim, and another violated and strangled a girl of 9, imagining an elaborate romance to escape the police. One of 9 killed his brother of 8 to get his new shoes. Another shot his 2 sisters, aged 14 and 16, because jealous of the preference shown them by his parents. 2 boys plotted and killed an old man, to amuse themselves. 11 boys banded together to steal and rob, partly for sheer mischief, stealing nothing of value. 2 boys of 15 fought a duel with pistols with seconds of the same age. A lad of 18 stabbed a strange girl who refused his advances in the street. Such cases could easily be multiplied indefinitely from the current chronicles of time. 11 Did these incidents actually occur? If so, are they indicative of universal, inevitable tendencies in teens or of the cultural problems of Hall's times? Biological determinism. Hall also cited the great and epic-making work of the Italian scholar Cesare Lombroso in the newly founded field of criminology, which demonstrated, said Hall, that criminals in general, tested anthropometrically, have smaller brains, larger jaws, and less facial expression than normal people. Criminals, said Hall, still discussing Lombroso, also love sententious phrases or obscene images, to which adolescents have a special predilection. Lombroso, said Hall, intimates that even some plants have criminal traits. 12 Although it's counterintuitive to blame teen problems on a theory like Lombroso's, after all, teens' skulls don't change much when teens grow up, Hall was convinced that physical shape was an important key to understanding teen problems. Citing a paper by George E. Dawson called A Study in Youthful Degeneracy, published in 1896, Hall wrote, Dawson found among boys and girls in reformatory institutions a tendency to shorter stature, lighter weight, diminished strength in the muscles of the hand, greater sensitiveness to pain, small, broad heads, broad faces, deformed palates and skulls, defects of sight and hearing, dullness of touch, and inferiority in attention, memory, and association. Degeneration of mind and morals is usually marked by morphological deviations from the normal. 13 But could the physical weakness, shorter stature and broad faces have had anything to do with the fact that most of the young people in reformatories were poor immigrants? These were the days when both the educated public and the new scientific field of psychology, which itself had only been founded in the late 1870s, were obsessed with finding biological explanations for human behavior. The Austrian physician Franz Joseph Gall had invented phrenology, the study of how head shapes were related to personality, in the late 1700s, and his ideas were more popular than ever, although still incorrect, 100 years later. Phrenology was still going strong in the early 1900s. American socialites couldn't wait to get their skulls measured by quack physicians carrying large calipers. Lombroso's theories of the late 1800s were derived from Gall's. Around this same time, racial psychology was making its way into the new psychology textbooks, and American and European intellectuals were also taken with eugenics, a program to improve the human race through selective breeding. Founded by Sir Francis Galton, Charles Darwin's first cousin, eugenics was intended to be the fast lane on the journey to that superanthropoid state Hall mentioned. Young people in action stabbing mom and dad in what has been called an alarming trend. More teens are taking out their frustrations on parents and guardians, stabbing them with scissors, pushing them downstairs, or even shooting them in the head. In the Houston area, more than 1,800 assaults of this sort were documented over a recent 2.5-year period. It's scary, said Chris Moore, a juvenile prosecutor in the area. 14 Biological determinism was very much in the air while Hall was writing his book, and Hall, a creature of his times, believed strongly that adolescence was determined, a fixed feature of human development that could be explained and accounted for in scientific fashion. To make his case, he relied on Haeckel's faulty recapitulation idea, Lombroso's faulty phrenology-inspired theories of crime, a plethora of anecdotes and one-sided interpretations of data. Given the issues, theories, standards and data handling methods of his day, he did a superb job. But when you take away the shoddy theories, put the anecdotes in their place, and look for alternate explanations of the data, the bronze statue tumbles hard. I have no doubt that many of the street teens of Hall's time were suffering or insufferable, but it's a serious mistake to develop a timeless, universal theory of human nature around the peculiarities of the people of one's own time and place. The teenage turmoil of Hall's day was not inevitable. Even Hall suggested at one point that teens might fare better if subjected to the regulatives they still have in older lands with more conservative traditions. 15 To FREUDS on teens in 1888, G. Stanley Hall became the first president of the newly founded Clark University in Massachusetts, which opened the following year. In 1909, Hall invited Sigmund Freud to speak there, along with Carl Jung and others, and to receive an honorary degree. This marked the first academic recognition Freud had ever received and the only honorary degree he would ever receive. Even though Freud was already revered in some circles, his Jewish heritage gave him few professional options in Europe. 16 This also marked his first and only trip to America. Freud was profoundly grateful to Hall for the honor he received at Clark, but he never adopted Hall's negative views on teens. Freud said little about teens over the course of his half-century career, barely anything compared with the tomes he wrote about childhood. If adolescence was a critically important part of human development, wouldn't Freud have noticed? The main task of the teen years, said Freud, is to cease to be a child, to detach from parents, and to become a member of the social community. 17 Freud also questioned the wisdom with which adults handle teens. It is remarkable, he wrote, how seldom teens are dealt with in the ideal manner, that is, in one which is correct both psychologically and socially. 18 Normal teens are abnormal. Freud's daughter Anna, on the other hand, herself a distinguished psychoanalyst, had a great deal to say about teens. She acknowledged her own depression as a teen, growing up around the turn of the 20th century in a home run with military strictness by her father, and even captured her teenage anguish in a poem, which reads in part, "For 1 hour, one day, I do so wish to be rid of myself, no longer to know my own face, my own poor hand, just once not to feel my thoughts." 19 Writing about teens in books and articles published mainly toward the end of her career, Anna Freud believed wholeheartedly in an adolescence dominated by Sturm und Drang, German for storm and stress. 20 According to her, it is normal for an adolescent to behave for a considerable length of time in an inconsistent and unpredictable manner, to fight his impulses and to accept them, to ward them off successfully and to be overrun by them, to love his parents and to hate them, to revolt against them and to be dependent on them, to be deeply ashamed to acknowledge his mother before others and, unexpectedly, to desire heart-to-heart talks with her. 21 She was so sure about the inevitability of turmoil during the teen years that she expressed concern about teens who seemed calm and happy. To be normal during the adolescent period, she said, is by itself abnormal. 22 Treating young people with dignity. Although G. Stanley Hall saw the teen years as necessarily dark, he didn't approve of the strict regimens and laws that were being implemented daily in early 20th century American to try to get teens under tight control. He knew that treating teens as mere children was a grave mistake. In effect, Hall warned against infantilization, just as I have been doing in this volume. Quoting colleague E.G. Lancaster and then speaking for himself, Hall wrote, according to Lancaster, at no time in life will a human being respond so heartily if treated by older and wiser people as if they were equals or even superiors. The attempt to treat a child at adolescence as you would treat an inferior is instantly fatal to good discipline. Parents still think of their offspring as mere children, and tighten the rein when they should loosen it. Many young people feel that they have the best of homes and yet that they will go crazy if they must remain in them. The one unpardonable thing for the adolescent is dullness, stupidity, lack of life, interest, and enthusiasm in school or teachers, and, perhaps above all, too great stringency. 23 Elsewhere in his book, Hall reminds us of the importance of treating young people with the kind of dignity we extend toward fellow adults. We are progressively forgetting that for the complete apprenticeship to life, youth needs repose, leisure, art, legends, romance, idealization, and in a word humanism, if it is to enter the kingdom of man well equipped for man's highest work in the world. 24 His perspective on young people is very different than the one I've been developing in this volume, but his advice is similar. It's a mistake to treat teens like children. For Hall, disciplining a teen is like provoking a wild animal, because, to him, teens are reliving the savagery of our evolutionary past. Unlike Hall, I'm certain that ontogeny is indifferent to phylogeny and that our evolutionary history doesn't require teens to behave savagely. Evolution equips us with a small number of reflexes, a wide range of individual differences, some general social tendencies, some significant gender differences, and an enormous capacity for learning. Not only do teens have the potential to be normal during the adolescent period, as far as I'm concerned this period shouldn't even be, it exists mainly because of ignorance on the part of adults. This still leaves us with a practical problem. Even if G. Stanley Hall and Anna Freud were wrong about the inevitability of adolescence, modern American teens often feel terrible and behave badly. Even if this is so because our culture has artificially extended childhood, we still need to face our self-created nightmare squarely. Just how much storm and stress do we see among modern teens? Wisdom of the ages. Yet another stage. In a 2001 textbook entitled Adolescence and Emerging Adulthood and Other Writings, psychologist Jeffrey Jansen Arnett identifies a new stage of life he calls emerging adulthood, a period from 18 to the mid-20s characterized by identity explorations, instability, self-focus, feeling in between, and possibilities. 25. In other words, recognizing that childhood has now been extended to age 26 or so in the United States, Arnett wants us to consider those last few years of extended childhood to be yet another stage of life. As pioneering sociologist W.I. Thomas once said, if men define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. It's likely that Arnett's label for this new stage will help to dignify and preserve it, but why reify these new years of extended childhood? Wouldn't we be better served by trying to understand and reverse the process that has produced them? 26G. Stanley Hall revisited Three Kinds of Turmoil in a 1999 article called Adolescent Storm and Stress, Reconsidered. Developmental psychologist Jeffrey Jansen Arnett of the University of Maryland College Park reviewed a variety of current research in primarily three areas: conflict with parents, mood problems, and risky behaviors. Arnett asked, was Hall right? In other words, does modern research with American teens confirm that they go through a period of extreme turmoil after puberty? The answer, he said, is yes. 27 Conflict with parents. According to Arnett, contemporary studies have established that conflict with parents increases in early adolescence compared with predolescence and typically remains high for a couple of years until declining in late adolescence. 28 According to one recent study he cites, a meta-analysis, which is a study of studies, within adolescence, conflict frequency is highest in early adolescence and conflict intensity is highest in mid-adolescence. 29 Conflict between parents and teens occurs about 20 times per month, according to one study, and is especially frequent and intense between mothers and early adolescent daughters. 30 Emotional closeness declines between parents and offspring during the teen years, and so does the amount of quality time that parents and their offspring spend together. Some experts believe, says Arnett, that conflict between teens and parents has an upside, that it might accelerate the rate at which teens learn to become independent, and that it might also help parents learn to let go. But anyone who's been there knows full well that this sort of conflict is far more destructive than helpful. Years ago, clinical psychologist Henry Marcachella told me that he thought teens were especially odd in one respect: they sometimes act like children and sometimes like adults, with no in-between state at all. I find this idea to be consistent with my recent thoughts about the artificial extension of childhood. Mom and Dad know you only as a child and have difficulty seeing you any other way. At some point, however, you begin to see yourself as an adult, and you try out your adult side with increasing frequency. When it works, when people show respect for what you say or do, you feel valued. When it fails, when people dismiss what you have to say out of hand, you revert to the only other state you know, childhood. This might sound dysfunctional, but it actually makes good sense. You know how to behave like a child quite well, for one thing, and when you behave this way, you also meet the expectations of those around you. It's not the most sophisticated kind of drama, but at least everyone knows their lines. Arnett confirms that adolescents do indeed report greater extremes of mood and more frequent changes of mood, compared with predolescents or adults. 31 A number of studies have assessed mood changes using the beeper method. Teens and adults are provided with beepers and instructed to make notes about their behavior, thoughts, and mood whenever the experimenters activate their beepers throughout the day. Such studies suggest that American teens experience a. greater extremes of emotions than do adults, especially negative emotions, b. frequent feelings of self-consciousness and embarrassment, 2 to 3 times as frequently as adults experience such feelings, c. frequent feelings of awkwardness, loneliness, and nervousness, and d. a general decline in happiness compared with how they felt as predolescents. 32 Young people in action, child or adult. In 2006, a 15-year-old male in Ephrata, Washington was convicted of a murder he committed when he was 12. According to prosecutors, the perpetrator planned the murder, beat the victim, a 13-year-old developmentally disabled individual, and then stabbed him 34 times. The sentence: 26 years in prison. 33 If this crime was truly premeditated, and if the perpetrator was of normal intelligence and could tell right from wrong, was it right to treat him as an adult, or should this case have been handled by the juvenile justice system? In the latter case, he might have served a few years in a reformatory and then would have had a clean record at age 18. Risky behaviors. I'll revisit this issue in the next section of this chapter, as well as in Chapter 7, but for now let's consider Arnett's findings. His review of the research literature leads him to conclude that the teen years in the United States are indeed a time of risk-taking, and that for some kinds of behaviors risk-taking continues into the early 20s. This pattern, he says, exists for crime as well as for behavior such as substance abuse, risky automobile driving, and risky sexual behavior. 34 specifically, rates of crime rise in the teens until peaking at age 18, then drop steeply. Rates of most types of substance abuse peak at about age 20. Rates of automobile accidents and fatalities are highest in the late teens. Rates of sexually transmitted diseases (STDs) peak in the early 20s, and 2/3 of all STDs are contracted by people who are under 25 years old. 0.35 In his review, Arnett also acknowledges that it is clear that the biological changes of puberty do not make adolescent storm and stress universal and inevitable. My italics. This is easily and unmistakably demonstrated, he says, by the fact that not all cultures experience the same levels of adolescent storm and stress, and some evidently do not experience it at all. 36 Finally, Arnett points out the obvious, that there are substantial individual differences in the way the teenage years play out. Not every teen has a tough time. An overview of turmoil in today's teens. We've seen some modest indications that teens aren't doing too badly, but we've also seen that in 3 important areas many American teens are indeed in rough shape: parental conflict, mood problems, and high-risk behaviors. Before we begin, in part 2 of this book, our detailed examination of the underlying capabilities of teens, let's look more closely at some major areas of concern, especially the ones that make the headlines every day: crime, substance abuse, sex, depression, and suicide. Violence and crime. A few years ago, I spoke about teen problems on a Fox television program called The O'Reilly Factor, hosted by the articulate, conservative host, Bill O'Reilly. The topic was teen gangs, prompted by the arrest of 9 middle-class gang members in Las Vegas who had videotaped each other brutally beating Pierce. I told O'Reilly what I've been telling you: teens are out of control because they've been treated like children and are isolated from adults. O'Reilly balked at first, saying that teens aren't emotionally equipped to be adults, but when I reminded him how much responsibility teens were able to handle only a few decades ago, during the Great Depression, for example, or during World War iodine monoiodide, he said, tentatively, that my perspective was interesting and important. He protested again when I said that those violent teens in Las Vegas, whose videos were being shown on screen as we spoke, were just trying to be adults. Nobody could call those kids adults, he said. But not only were they emulating what adults do, they had transformed themselves into adults instantly by committing a serious crime. In fact, news reports had already indicated that all 9 teens were going to be tried in court as adults. Whether we like the idea or not, young people who commit serious crimes are indeed emulating adults, adult behavior, adult emotions, and adult ideas. They see adults on the streets, on TV, in movies, and in newspapers and magazines doing heinous things every day. What's more, when a young person commits a crime, he or she is demonstrating control over his or her own life. A crime says, I'm powerful. I'm strong. I'm fearless. I'm independent of my parents and my teachers. And if it's serious enough, a crime makes you an adult officially, instantly transforming you in the eyes of the law from a child who would normally be shielded by the dubious protections of the juvenile justice system into an adult criminal, subject to the rigors of adult criminal court. As a bonus, a serious crime also gives you a full set of constitutional rights, which guarantees you a lawyer, a speedy trial, the right to confront your witnesses, the right to a court transcript, and so on. Wisdom of the age is the strength of wild animals. Should a young person feel that the environment tries to deprive him too radically of all the forms of expression which permit him to develop, he may resist with the wild strength encountered in animals who are suddenly forced to defend their lives. Erik Erikson, Identity, Youth and Crisis, 1968. Here is an overview of the criminal proclivities of some young people in America today. Gangs. According to the 2002 National Youth Gang Survey, conducted by the National Youth Gang Center, an agency of the federal government's Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, all United States cities with populations over 250,000 have significant gang activity each year, and roughly 1/3 of gang members are female. 0.37 Gang involvement sometimes begins when children are as young as 7 or 8, and a 1998 survey of 6,000 8th graders in 11 cities found that 11% of them were currently members of gangs. 0.38 Most gangs engage in at least some criminal activities, including assault, homicide, tagging, hate crimes, larceny, drug trafficking, and vehicle theft. Common gang weapons include bats, pipes, spiked wristbands, chemical mace, knives, handguns, sawed-off shotguns, Uzi machine guns, AK-47 assault rifles, 9mm semi-automatic handguns, homemade bombs, Molotov cocktails, and grenades. In 2007, there were roughly 27,000 active gangs, 5,000 more than in 2002, and 788,000 gang members in the Most between ages 14 and 24.39 in 2004. More than half of the homicides in Los Angeles County were gang-related. 40 Like it or not, gang activity is not childlike, it is most definitely adult. Gangs emulate small governments and armies. They have charismatic leaders, nationalistic loyalties, emblems, hierarchies, dress codes, intricate communication systems, colors, rights, traditions, ranks, territories, strict codes of conduct and systems of justice, promotion, demotion and expulsion, just like adult armies. Violence at schools. School violence has been and continues to be a problem nationwide. Schools are targets for violence because A. Many young people resent being forced to go to school, and for some, school is a place of failure and frustration. B. Schools crowd large numbers of young people together for long periods each day and hence serve as breeding grounds for gangs, cliques, jealousies, rivalries and bullying, as well as racial, ethnic and religious conflicts. And C. Schools are where the enemies are located, the strict or insensitive teachers and administrators, the bullies, the romantic and social rivals and so on. According to the CDC, in 2007, 36% of high school students had been in a physical fight during the last year, and 18% of high school students had carried a weapon, a gun, club or knife, to school within the prior month. 41 According to a 1998 report by the United States Department of Education, more than 6,000 students had been expelled from American schools the previous year for bringing firearms or explosives to school, 56% of those from high schools, 34% from middle schools and 9% from elementary schools. 42 Of even greater concern, between 1993 and 2008, more than 350 people were killed in shooting incidents on school grounds and many more wounded. In the worst such incident, on April 20, 1999, 2 students at Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado killed 12 students and 1 teacher and wounded 23 others before killing themselves. They had spent a year planning the attack, which was supposed to kill more than 500 people, but the bombs they had planted were disabled by police. 43 More recently, a 16-year-old student at a high school in Red Lake, Minnesota, injured 7 people and killed 10, among them 5 students, a security guard and a teacher at his school. 44 Various plots against schools continue to be uncovered. 45 Gambling. Recent studies suggest that gambling is now a more prevalent problem among teens than drinking, cigarettes or marijuana. One study claims that upwards of 80% of young people between 12 and 17 have gambled in the last 12 months, and many young gamblers start to roll the dice at age 10 or younger. Between 4 and 8% of young people in the U.S. now have a serious gambling problem. 46 Crime. Young people commit a large number of crimes in the United States every year, more than 3 million on school campuses alone. 47 Many youth crimes are violent, and the public has demanded tougher remedies, often based on sensational media reports, such as a recent Associated Press article about teens in Lompoc, California who set fire to a homeless man. 48 Rather than on sound statistics. That said, the legitimate statistics are disturbing. Nationwide, 1.65 million juveniles were arrested in 2007.49 in California. The arrest rate among people ages 10 to 17 for law violations was 4,313 per 100,000 in 2007, a drop from a peak of 9,313 in 1974, but still 30% higher than the 1960 rate. 50 Nationwide, the overall rate of violent crimes by teens increased by 49% between 1980 and 1996.51. FBI statistics suggest that the peak age at which people, of all ages, commit violent crimes is 18. See Appendix 3 for further details. 52 According to a comprehensive 2001 report by the National Research Council, most juveniles break laws, although only 4% of juvenile arrests are for serious crimes. As of 2006, data from the FBI suggested dramatic upward spike in teen violence. In Boston alone, a 54% increase in robberies and a 103% increase in weapons arrests between 2004 and 2005.53. The proportion of female juveniles arrested for committing a crime has increased steadily since at least the early 1980s. In 1986, females accounted for 22% of juvenile arrests, a figure that increased to 30% by 2004.54. As of early 2005, 72 people were on death row for murders they committed as minors. Their sentences were reduced under the Supreme Court's recent decision in Roper v. Simmons, which prohibits executing offenders who committed their crimes before age 18. See Chapter 14.55 Guns. According to a national survey in 2007, a third of our teens know someone who has been shot. The proportion is twice as high for African Americans. The survey also found that 40% of high school students fear gun violence at their schools. 80% of the teens who were killed in the U.S. in 2005 were victims of gun violence, as were about half of teen suicides. 57 Homicide. Homicide is the second leading cause of death for young men and women, combined, between 15 and 19, and it's now the third leading cause of death for young women between 15 and 19. About 20% of deaths in the 10 to 24 age group are due to homicide. Many of these deaths are caused by adults, but they are usually adults who are involved in gang or other activities with the minors. 58 Juvenile Court. As noted earlier, juvenile courts process 1.65 million cases per year, with roughly 7,000 cases being waived to the adult criminal courts in 2005, an increase of 40% over 2000. Nationwide, we spent $5.7 billion in 2007 to keep more than 64,000 young offenders locked up. 59 Types of crimes. Young people commit the full range of crimes committed by adults: rape, homicide, larceny, bank robbery, drug possession and sales, arson, assault, forgery and so on, and, as I noted in Chapter 2, they are also arrested for offenses that have been created especially for minors, such as truancy, running away, incorrigibility, curfew violations and drinking alcohol. In some categories, e.g., property crimes and theft, teens are more active than adults. In others, e.g., murder and aggravated assault, they're less active. Sometimes teens get creative. In Florida and California, occupants of several cars were killed recently when teens dropped large rocks or bricks off of highway overpasses. 62 It's no wonder that there's a term, phobiphobia, for fear of teenagers. 63 Young people in action when parents give up. What do you do when your teens are too ornery to handle? Melissa Dean's solution was to go on strike. In 2008, this Ocala, Florida mom left her 4 hefty sons to fend for themselves after her determined efforts to keep them in check had failed. She was arrested and charged with neglect. 60 Also in 2008, after Nebraska's legislators carelessly enacted a safe haven law without specifying an age limit, it was intended for newborns. Parents from several states drove long distances to deposit their teenagers on hospital doorsteps. With more than 30 young people languishing in Nebraskan facilities, an emergency session of the legislature was called, and the error was corrected. 61 Drugs and alcohol serve many purposes, both for adults and for young people. Actress Carrie Fisher, of Star Wars fame, used psychoactive substances to self-medicate. She began abusing chemicals when she was a teen. It was 10 years before a mental health professional figured out that she had long been suffering from bipolar disorder. 64 It's common for young people to use drugs and alcohol in this way, to relieve the pain of their own persistent psychological or physical problems. Teens and adults also drink or take drugs to impress, manipulate or bond with friends, colleagues or lovers. Ecstasy, one fairly popular drug among young people, is supposed to be an especially effective mood booster and friendship maker. Alcoholic beverages are produced by a $137 billion industry. Although alcohol providers aren't allowed to sell directly to young people, they still make money when young people drink their products. Someone is paying for it, after all. Legal drugs, such as Ritalin, Prozac, and Xanax, are provided by a $313 billion industry in the United States alone, which spends more than $15 billion per year to convince consumers to take their products and physicians to prescribe them. In recent years, this industry has made concerted efforts to expand into the youth markets, in some cases convincing physicians to prescribe drugs to children which had never been tested on children or approved for their use. 65 The illegal drug industry, providing drugs such as ecstasy, marijuana, cocaine, PCP and heroin, conducts perhaps $50 billion worth of business each year in the United States. 66 Young people are the main targets of this industry for simple reasons. It's difficult for them to purchase alcohol over the counter, and they don't have control over their prescription medications or medical treatment. If Jamie Lee Curtis or Rush Limbaugh want more vodka or Vicodin, they can get them legitimately and privately. Limbaugh was unclear on that, it seems, but young people don't have such options. The solution, the corner connection. Here is a quick overview of drug and alcohol-related activities by American young people today. Prescription drugs. The rate at which young people have been taking prescription drugs, both legally and illegally, has increased dramatically in recent years. Non-medical use of the painkiller OxyContin, for example, has increased by 30% since 2002. 1 in 10 high school seniors report having taken Vicodin recreationally within the past year, and 15% of seniors now say they have abused prescription drugs. 67 The overall trend for prescribing behavior-altering drugs to children and teens is even more discouraging. Increases of between 21 and 71% for various drugs in a recent 3-year period, mainly for treating depression, and ADHD. The bottom line, spending on behavior-altering drugs for minors has now edged out spending for all other drugs, including antibiotics and medications for asthma, allergies and skin conditions. 0.68 Because adults both prescribe and take such drugs, many of which are now advertised incessantly on television, our society sends a clear message to young people: drugs are an easy way to a better life. One recent trend, farming parties at which young people trade and sample prescription drugs, some their own and some stolen. 0.69 Several new studies, both by private researchers and the U.S. government, confirm a shift by teens away from some of the usual illegal drugs, such as marijuana, toward recreational, non-medical use of prescription drugs. 0.70 Emergency treatment. The shift away from some drugs suggests to some pundits that the teen drug crisis is under control. It isn't. As of 2008, nearly half of high school seniors report having used illegal drugs, and emergency room data, objective indicators of drug use patterns, suggest that teens are as high as ever. According to the Drug Abuse Warning Network, a federal program that monitors drug-related hospital visits and deaths, more than 200,000 Americans between ages 12 and 17 were treated in emergency rooms in 2006 because of adverse experiences with illegal drugs, alcohol or the non-medical use of prescription drugs, a substantial increase from 2005. More than 20,000 of these visits involved suicide attempts. 0.71 Between 1999 and 2004, calls to California's poison control hotline by people ages 9 to 17 related to overdoses of dextromethorphan, an ingredient in cough syrups, increased 15-fold. Consuming large doses of dextromethorphan, a practice teens call robo-tripping or skittling, can cause euphoria and hallucinations, as well as seizures and death. 0.72 School shooters. Although it's unreasonable to blame school shootings on prescription medications, there aren't enough data to support that idea. It's interesting to note that some of the most notorious school shooters were taking psychotropic drugs. Kip Kinkle, the 15-year-old from Oregon who killed his parents and two students in 1998, was taking the antidepressant Prozac, as was Jeffrey Weiss, the shooter in the 2005 Red Lake Massacre. T.J. Solomon, the 15-year-old from Georgia who shot 6 students in 1999, was on the drug Ritalin, and Eric Harris, one of the Columbine shooters, was taking the antidepressant Luvox. 0.73 Marijuana. A recent survey suggests that 38% of our high school students have tried marijuana, a drop from previous years. That said, the same survey reports that about 20% of students had smoked marijuana within the past 30 days, a rate that hasn't changed much. The marijuana smoked by today's young people is about 10 times as potent as that available in the 1960s. 0.74 Alcohol. About 75% of our high school students have tried alcohol, and more than half of high school juniors and seniors drink regularly, even though doing so is illegal. What's more, 26% of high school students admit to frequent binge drinking, consuming 5 or more drinks in a row. Teens also drink and drive, but the rumor you've heard about teens being the scourge of our highways doesn't hold up to the numbers. In 2007, drunk young people ages 16 to 20 accounted for 18% of the fatal crashes in the U.S., an alarming figure when you consider that only about 6% of licensed drivers are in this age group. But teens don't hold a candle to their legally drinking elders. People between 21 and 24, just 8% of licensed drivers, accounted for a whopping 35% of fatal, alcohol-related crashes. 0.75 Street drugs. Young people also use cocaine, crack cocaine, heroin and hallucinogens such as LSD and PCP, also called angel dust. They've also discovered ways to get high on a variety of inhalants, including gasoline, nitrous oxide, aerosol sprays and airplane glue. Ecstasy, MDMA, sometimes called X-candy, or the love drug, a mild hallucinogen, was especially popular among young people a few years ago, and it even has defenders in the adult professional community. 0.76 Although the popularity of particular street drugs waxes and wanes, emergency room data make it clear that there are ongoing, serious problems. In 2006, 44,088 people between ages 12 and 17 were treated for adverse reactions to marijuana, 10,984 for problems with cocaine, 7,740 for problems with stimulants, such as methamphetamine, and 4,524 for problems with ecstasy. 0.77 GHB, gamma-hydroxybutyrate, a date rape drug also known as G or Easy Lay, can be mixed up at home following instructions on the internet. 0.78 Wisdom of the ages. The standardized teen youth after youth, bewildered by the incapacity to assume a role forced on him by the inexorable standardization of American adolescence, runs away in one form or another, dropping out of school, leaving jobs, staying out all night, or withdrawing into bizarre and inaccessible moods. Eric Erickson, Identity, Youth in Crisis, 1968, Steroids. In their obsession to look like their athletic heroes in the movies and magazines, about 2.2% of high school seniors, mainly males, have tried anabolic steroids without a physician's prescription. Steroids increase strength and muscle mass, but they can also damage the reproductive system and cause serious mood problems. 0.79 Cigarettes. As of 2008, about 20% of American high school students smoked cigarettes, matching the proportion for adults. Roughly 3,600 American teens try cigarettes every day, and 1,100 become regular smokers. Following the national trend for adults, teen smoking is becoming less common. 0.80 Social context. Drug and alcohol abuse is glorified every day in America in movies, on television, on the internet, and in novels, magazines, and comic books. Attractive, trendy young people are frequently higher drunk in movies such as Animal House, Requiem for a Dream, and Dazed and Confused, and we also glorify illegal drug use by adults in movies such as Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. The Woodstock Music Festival of 1969, attended by 500,000 young people, was famous for its open drug use, and that tradition is going strong. The open use of drugs by both young and old, some of whom were probably at Woodstock, is still common in festivals such as the annual Burning Man, which drew nearly 50,000 attendees to the Black Rock Desert in Nevada in 2008. That teens have a strong interest in drugs and alcohol should surprise no one. When teens get high, they're both imitating their elders and impressing their peers. And no matter what the surveys say, the real extent of teen substance abuse is unclear for the simple reason that substance abuse is secret. When public opinion becomes more negative, the secrets go deeper. Given that emergency room admissions appear to be flat or increasing, however, overall usage is probably flat or increasing too. Like it or not, widespread drug and alcohol use by young people is a fixture in American society. Sexual activity. Your perspective on teen sex might change when you read Chapter 8. Mine did when I wrote it, but meanwhile, let's take a quick look at two aspects of the sexuality of today's American teens: pregnancy and STDs. Bear in mind that young people who have sex are definitely not behaving like children. One might quibble about the meaning of crimes that young people commit, but there is no question about the meaning of the sex they have. They're behaving like the young adults they really are, exactly as evolution intended. What's more, sex is an easy route to adulthood in this country. In most states, one is instantly emancipated from parents when one marries, and one instantly takes on many adult rights and responsibilities when one gives birth. Figure 5.1. International teen birth rates. Teen birth rates in the United States are substantially higher than those of other industrialized nations, 80% higher than the United Kingdom, 10 times as high as the Netherlands. Source: United Nations. Pregnancy. According to government researchers, 82% of teen pregnancies are unintended, resulting in about 750,000 live births and more than 350,000 miscarriages or induced abortions each year. 0.81 Although the birth rate for teens had been dropping for more than a dozen years, it is now increasing again and is occurring at an overall rate of 43 births per 1,015 to 19-year-old women, the highest rate by far in the industrialized world. To put this number in perspective, consider that the teen birth rate in France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Sweden and other industrialized countries is less than 10 births per thousand. Figure 5.1.83 Young people in action. The Juno effect. In 2008, at Gloucester High School in Gloucester, Massachusetts, an unusual number of students, all under 17, began requesting pregnancy tests at the school's clinic. By June, 17 young women were pregnant, more than 4 times the number from the previous year. School officials concluded that students had entered into a pregnancy pact, perhaps inspired by the recent film, Juno, which glorifies a teen pregnancy. 0.82 Sexually transmitted diseases. In early 2008, the public was shocked by the results of a new study headed by Dr. Sarah Forhan of the Centers for Disease Control, showing that 1 in 4 female teens in the U.S. now has at least one sexually transmitted disease. Among blacks, the infection rate is close to 1/2. Experts blame the epidemic on more sex and less sex education, perhaps brought about by the aggressive abstinence-only sex education program promoted by the Bush administration. 0.84 As of 2007, about 38% of sexually active teens reported having sex regularly without a condom. 0.85 Cognitive, emotional and behavioral disorders. On television a few years ago, I caught an especially eerie film called The Virgin Suicides, starring James Woods, Kathleen Turner and Kirsten Dunst. In this 1999 film, based on a 1994 novel by Jeffrey Eugenides, young male teens recount their obsession with the 5 Lisbon sisters, the dreamy and mysterious teenage inhabitants of a house in their neighborhood. After 13-year-old Cecilia commits suicide, slitting her wrists didn't work, so a few weeks later she jumped off the roof and was impaled on a fence. Their controlling mom, Turner, becomes stricter than ever. She pulls the sisters out of school and makes them prisoners in their home. They spend most of their time languishing in bed, dreaming about exotic places. The most beautiful sister, Lux Dunst, asserts her independence by having sex with random men on the roof. At the end of the film, all 4 of the remaining sisters commit suicide on the same night. Elements of this film are all too realistic. Parents are sometimes fatally controlling, teens often languish, and young people sometimes take their own lives, at least in modern America. Near the end of the film, barely noticeable and in the background, a drunken, tuxedo-clad young man falls backward into a swimming pool at a posh party. As he's climbing out he says, "You don't understand me. I'm a teenager. I got problems." That not only describes the role that American teens believe they're supposed to play in life, it also fits adult perceptions of teens, as well as the credible data. Jeffrey Arnett's review of research on storm and stress reminded us of the obvious, that the moods of American teens are often disturbed. But that's just one among many aberrations in the world of teen mental health. Here are some others. Suicide. The pattern of suicides among our nation's youth is especially disturbing. Looking at suicides in the U.S. over the past century, David M. Cutler and Edward Glazer of Harvard's Department of Economics and Karen Norberg of the National Bureau of Economic Research concluded, suicide rates among youths ages 15 to 24 have tripled in the past half-century, even as rates for adults and the elderly have declined. And for every youth suicide completion, there are nearly 400 suicide attempts. They note that this trend is surprising. Normally, suicide becomes more likely as people get older. They speculate that one of the major factors contributing to this trend is a lack of direct economic or familial power. Suicide is a way that young people try to resolve conflicts or signal distress. 86 But where there are crises, there are also opportunities, in this case for the drug companies. With the youth suicide rate at an all-time high in the mid-1990s, rather than addressing the causes of the problem, parents, physicians and policymakers went for the quick fix. Between 1995 and 2001, the rate at which psychotropic drugs were prescribed for teens increased by 250%. 87 The drugs reduced the rate of completed suicides but had little effect on attempts. About 1.5 million people between 15 and 19 continue to signal distress in this way every year. 88 The relationship between the drugs and the suicide rate is undeniable. After the FDA announced in 2003 that antidepressant drugs might cause some young people to become suicidal, usage declined by 22% and the suicide rate surged by 14%. A 2007 study confirms this effect in both the US and the Netherlands. 89 Even with the drugs, the current suicide rate among our teens is still nearly 3 times the 1950 rate. 90 Suicidal thinking is more common among youth in poor neighborhoods, and the rate at which they attempt suicide is perhaps 4 times the norm. Suicide is now the 3rd leading cause of death among our teens, and many deaths that aren't labeled that way probably should be. Many reckless, violent crimes by young people, especially young blacks, are really cases of suicide by cop, which is believed to account for 13% of justifiable police homicides. 91 Among the 10 young people who committed suicide in Los Angeles County in 2007, 2 were 14 and 1 was 11.92 depression. As I noted in Chapter 1, in 2007, nearly 40% of America's teens were treated for major depression. 93 Depressive tendencies increase somewhat among males over the teen years and more dramatically among females. Although young males kill themselves more frequently than young females do, females attempt suicide twice as frequently as males. 94 Depression has long been an epidemic among teens, and mental health professionals, spurred by intense campaigns by major drug companies, are now beginning to diagnose it earlier, even in toddlers. An extensive 2004 study of sadness by Rosemary Kobow and her colleagues at the CDC suggests that the peak age of sadness among American adults 18 and over is 18.95 other disorders. In a report issued in early 2009, the National Research Council and the Institute of Medicine estimated that between 14 and 20% of our young people have a diagnosable mental, behavioral or emotional disorder, costing the nation $247 billion a year. According to Kenneth E. Warner, chair of the committee that wrote the report, there is a substantial gap between what is known about preventing mental, emotional and behavioral disorders and what is actually being done. 96 Loss of control. As childhood continues to be extended into later years, it's inevitable that young people will feel like they have less control over their lives. In a recent study, Jean Twenge and her colleagues, summarizing data obtained with more than 18,000 college students between 1960 and 2002, found that over this period, young people have come to believe that their actions are more controlled by outside forces than by their own efforts. 97 This disturbing finding is consistent with the clinical experiences of British psychiatrist Philip Graham, whose work I mentioned in Chapter 1. A 2007 study also shows an inverse relationship between autonomy and depression. The lower the feelings of autonomy, the greater the depression. 0.98 Self-injury. New research suggests that between 15 and 22% of our young people have purposely injured themselves. The problem is more severe among young females, and it appears to be growing. Self-injury ranges from cutting, burning or biting one's body to embedding objects such as paper clips, needles, stones or glass shards under the skin. For some, self-injury is a sign of depression and a precursor to suicide, but most self-abusers are just trying to turn their attention away from the unpleasantness of life. 0.99 Getting in trouble. Troubled youth often end up in trouble. Roughly half of the high school students with severe emotional problems drop out, and about 1 in 5 students with such problems are arrested at least once before age 18. 3/4 of the young people in juvenile corrections facilities are supposedly diagnosable with behavioral or emotional disorders. 0.100 Abandonment. According to an investigative article in the Washington Post by Shankar Vedantam, each year in the United States, desperate parents turn over thousands of children and teens to child welfare services as a means of getting them psychological help. Because mental health services are often not covered by insurance, parents often have no choice but to file complaints with social workers or police in order to get help. Residential treatment centers for psychological problems can cost up to $300,000 per year. By turning young people over to authorities, the state ends up footing the bill. The exact number of young people who are disposed of in this way is difficult to determine, but Vedantam reports that in Pima County, Arizona alone, 1,750 young people were turned over to child welfare officials for this purpose in 2001. Nationwide, the total could be in the hundreds of thousands. 0.101 Eating disorders. Eating disorders are far more prevalent in young people, especially young females, than in adults. Eating disorders are the third most common chronic illness among adolescent females. Virtually all young females in our society diet to some extent, but in some cases they do so dangerously and for long periods. In the condition called anorexia nervosa, young women starve themselves, sometimes to death. About 1 in 100 teenage females are anorexic. Perhaps 1/10 that many males also limit their food intake excessively. In a related disorder called bulimia, women are also obsessed with their weight, but they tend to gorge themselves and then to eliminate the food by forced vomiting. Bulimia is rare in young teens, it tends to emerge in the late teens or early 20s. The prevalence of bulimia is difficult to determine because bulimics are extremely secretive about their condition. Other extreme weight control measures are becoming more prevalent. Nearly 6% of today's teens have used diet pills, powders or liquids without a doctor's advice to lose weight or keep from gaining weight. 0.102 Obesity. According to recent studies, the proportion of obese young people in the U.S. increased from 13.9% in 1999 to 16.3% in 2006, and less than a third of teens now get the government-recommended hour of daily physical activity. Pediatricians are now treating obesity-related health problems not traditionally seen until adulthood, including hypertension, sleep apnea, diabetes and orthopedic issues. In California, teen obesity prevalence rose from 13.9% in 2003 to 19.8% in 2005. Nearly half of California teens now eat fast food at least once a day. 0.103 Anger. As we've already seen, American teens get angry a lot. Just one footnote, headlines have been telling us in recent years that research shows that teen anger and aggression is caused by the violence young people see in movies, on television and in video games. But virtually all of this research is correlational, which means that it doesn't support the strong conclusions being drawn from it. We know that people with violent tendencies are drawn more to violent content than peaceful people are. That fact alone can account for most, if not all, of the correlations my colleagues keep reporting. It's also possible that violent content makes some people more peaceful through a process called catharsis. The baby boomers were raised on violent media content, army and cowboy shoot-em-ups, without suffering any obvious ill effects. Communications professor Jip Fowles reviews some of the relevant research and shoddy thinking on this sensitive topic in a 1999 book called The Case for Television Violence. 0.104 Our troubled teens. American teens are among the most troubled in the world, and the teen years are the most difficult that we experience in life. Our teens are difficult to raise, often unhappy at home, overly immersed in a vacuous teen world that's largely the creation of large corporations, excessively interested in their appearance, overly dependent on drugs and alcohol, unnecessarily careless about sex and excessively angry, violent, moody and depressed, suffering from a preventable condition we might call extended childhood disorder, ECD. The principal characteristic of ECD is a feeling that one lacks control over one's life, which is precisely the problem that psychiatrist Philip Graham has found repeatedly in troubled teens. Gene Twinge's research also suggests that it's a growing problem. G. Stanley Hall was wrong about recapitulation and wrong about the inevitability of teen turmoil, but he was correct in his characterization of the highly troubled teens that newly industrialized America was manufacturing. Now, a century later, they're considerably worse. A disturbing connection, infantilizaton and teen turmoil. In Chapter 1, I described one of the results of the study I conducted recently with Diane Dumas. When we gave our 42-item infantilization scale to 100 teens, from ages 13 to 17, we found that their average score was over 26, suggesting that teens in modern America are often treated like children. There is another outcome of our study, though, that's even more disturbing. We also gave these teens a standardized test called the Adolescent Psychopathology Scale, APS, which measures a wide variety of indicators of behavioral, cognitive and emotional disorders. 0.105. As one might expect, we found a fairly large, positive correlation, R equals 0.43, between the infantilization scores and the psychopathology scores. The more we treat teens like children, the more signs of psychopathology they show. Although this is a dramatic result, it doesn't prove that psychopathology in teens is caused by infantilization. Our result could also suggest that teens who act out are also the most likely to be restricted by parents or other authorities. 0.106. Correlational findings. The vast majority of findings we see reported in the media every day cannot establish causal relationships. Probable cause: the artificial extension of childhood. G. Stanley Hall conjectured that treating teens like children would produce instantly fatal results: anger, hostility and tendencies to escape, among other things. In other words, multiple signs of psychopathology. Now we have correlational findings, the research I conducted with Diane Dumas, that are consistent with Hall's conjecture. We have also seen the following: a spiraling increase in both the laws that restrict teens and the variety and intensity of teen problems that have emerged over the last century. Chapter 2. Few signs of teen turmoil in cultures that maintain a continuum between childhood and adulthood, as well as evidence that teen problems emerge in these cultures when that continuum is broken. Chapter 3. Evidence that even troubled American teens sometimes straighten out overnight when given heavy doses of responsibility and respect. Chapter 4. Finally, we have our common sense, which suggests that the more restrictions you place on people who consider themselves to be autonomous and competent, the angrier and less manageable they become. I believe we can draw only one reasonable conclusion from these observations: the turmoil we see during the teens' years in modern America is caused by the artificial extension of childhood past puberty. We hold our young people back and isolate them completely from adulthood. Many react in hostile or self-destructive ways. Q. Isn't all the aggression and craziness we see in teenagers caused by hormones? A. Although puberty brings about significant hormonal changes, such changes are not the cause of teen turmoil. Tens of millions of teens in pre-industrial nations around the world also reach puberty every year, but the mood problems we see in America are absent or nearly so in such countries. Moreover, physiological research shows that the hormonal changes that occur during pubertal maturation don't predict behavior very well. 0.105. Teen problems in the United States are caused by two factors related to the artificial extension of childhood. We treat young adults as if they are still children, and we isolate them from adults, trapping them in the media-controlled world of teen culture. No mainstream scientist takes Haeckel's recapitulation theory seriously. Consider this unambiguous statement from The Beginnings of Human Life, New York, Springer Verlag, 1977, p. 32, by biologist Eric Blechschmidt. The so-called basic law of biogenetics is wrong. No buts or ifs can mitigate this fact. It is not even a tiny bit correct, or correct in a different form. It is totally wrong. According to a 2001 report on juvenile crime by the National Research Council, contrary to their intentions, schools appear to foster problems among misbehaving children and adolescents through such common practices as tracking, grade retention, suspension, and expulsion. The panel took special note of apparent racial and ethnic biases in the administration of these practices. p. 4.47*. This correlation was between scores on our infantilization scale, iodine monosulfide, and scores on the externalizing scale of the APS. The latter looks at problems such as substance abuse, anger, aggression and interpersonal difficulties, the kinds of behaviors one sees most often in troubled teens. The correlation between the IS scores and scores on the internalizing scale of the APS, which looks at issues such as boredom, introversion and self-concept, was smaller, R equals 0.15, and not significant, P less than 0.15. Part 2. The capabilities of young people. Chapter 6 Adultness. Teach your parents well. Their children's hell will slowly go by, and feed them on your dreams. The one they fix, the one you'll know by. Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young. Teach your children well. Overview. Adults don't